I believe C Company was to our far left. Borelli had his platoon to the left of the second platoon, and we went into the woods. Suddenly, Spears said, "There they are," and he was pointed, but beyond another German we didn't see for some reason. Well, they were well camouflaged in white, and this man was just about 20 feet in front of him. And the man shot Spear right through the mouth. Of course, it tore his back of his neck out, his spine. He was dead before he hit the ground.
We're bringing to you from our archives via Mark Bando. We're very grateful that he has given us some of his archive to put out on the channel and to also have at the Gettysburg Museum of History. But this one that we're releasing today is from Don Burgett. Now, Don Burgett was in the 101st Airborne, and he was, one of the more famous vets because he actually wrote several books very early on. He wrote a book about Normandy called Curragh, and I would normally have my copy here, but it's in the other building, so I just made a quick copy of it. But he also wrote one about Operation Market Garden called The Road to Arnhem, and he also wrote one about Bastogne called The Seven Roads to Hell, and one about the end of the war and the time in Germany, which was Beyond the Rhine. But I met Don several years ago. I think this picture was taken at the 70th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy. He was a great guy, very friendly and very knowledgeable, and he's a very important historian, and his books are amazing, so check out his books. But here's an interview that Mark Bando did several years ago. Very grateful to have that from Mark Bando.
Okay, I'm Donald R. Burgett. And I was in A Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne. We was in World War II, or I was in World War II with a bunch of other paratroopers, a lot of other people. But this part that I'm going to tell about now is at the time that we went into Bastogne. And it started for us that right after we had gotten out of Holland. We were in Holland for 72 days, and during that time the weather was wet, the ground was wet, and we stayed wet for 72 days. It rained almost every day, and plus the water that was in the ground. So when we finally did get relieved from Holland, there wasn't too many of us left. A lot of men wounded, a lot of casualties. A lot of the casualties were from trench foot, from the wet ground and things like that, and sicknesses, illness, rashes, and plus being wounded, and a lot of them killed. So we were reduced to about 38 men, I think, in the company when we got out of Holland. And of course, at that time, our weapons were all misused or abused, hole shot in some of the machine guns and different things. And the rust, you can't keep everything clean, and in battle, your equipment takes a terrible toll. So when we came out of Holland, we arrived back by truck to a little town in France called Marmolon-le-Grand. And we were stationed in some old French barracks that was left over from World War I. There were zigzag trenches outside that had eroded in, and I even dug up an old French helmet with a bullet hole through it in one of the trenches. And so the war from 1918 had taken place there, and a lot of the buildings still had holes in them from the shells, and they were never repaired. They weren't very comfortable with old masonry floors and stone floors and masonry. And you just couldn't warm them up, and they were always damp. But that's where we were at Then we were doing maneuvers at this time that kept us busy, kept us sharp, and they started bringing in replacement men. And we had sent most of our weapons out to the ordnance to get them repaired, like the machine guns. Sometimes the feeder paws on the machine guns were worn, and so everything had to be gone over mortars, the sights on the mortars, the bipods, the base plates, and so on. So we were in this little town of Marmelin-le-Grand. Most of the men were beat. They had trench foot from being 72 days in water, Holland, and weapons were all deteriorated. And most of them were that we did have had been taken up by ordnance to be repaired. So there we were, in a pretty good state of disrepair. But the high command saw fit to take a lot of us seniority-wise, and at the age of 19, I was one of the high seniority men, having gone through Holland and Normandy. So they took a bunch of us, convoy at a time, into Paris, the city of light, to do whatever became normal or natural. Blow off steam, spend our back pay, and see all the mademoiselles and drink as much wine as we could. But we had our 72 hours there, and the convoy I was with returned back to Marmelin-le-Grand, and 6x6 trucks, canvas covered, and we had to ride in the back all the way back. And of course, once we got back to the camp, we were telling these new young replacements, as we call the young men, and some of them were older than I was, but we called them young men because they were new in the outfit. They were replacements. And at 19, like I said, I'm one of the old men. But we were telling them all about Paris and all the different things that happened there, and what you could do and get away with, and the money you spent and on what, and the good times we had, and the Eiffel Tower and different things, even the landmarks. We even managed to look at some of those. And then we finally got to sleep about 2 or 2:30 in the morning. And our beds were made out of 2x4s with wood slats, straw mattresses, and I had the upper bunk and Spear had the bottom bunk. And I just got settled in when the door flew open and Bedlin came in. And he said, "Okay, make your seaborne rolls, we're going in." Well, seaborne rolls meant one thing, it meant combat. And so he said, we asked him what was going on, and he said, well, there's been some sort of a breakthrough in the infantry's lines, and we had to go up and straighten it out. Nobody knew anything the exact extent of the breakthrough, or why or where, anything. So a lot of us started grumbling, why can't the infantry take care of themselves? We did our share, and as soon as we turn our backs and go to Paris once, they goof up. Well, we didn't know the magnitude of this thing, and I don't think anyone else did. But it's natural for soldiers or GIs to gripe anyway. So anyway, we did get out of the sack. We made our seaborne rolls, and then we fell out to the supply rooms and drew whatever we could. They didn't have anything really, or very much there. One man would get a trench knife, the next man would get a helmet, the next one would get something else, and so we were very ill-equipped, and physically we weren't in the best of shape after 72 days of combat. But by morning, we got everything ready, and the sun had come up, and we went and had breakfast at the battalion mess hall. And then we had a little time to spare, and so we reformed casual, like there was no orders, nobody giving orders or pushing people around or reforming or anything like that. They just said, be out the front at a certain time. And so we kind of drifted up that way. And they had a large convoy of open trailer trucks came in, semi-trailers. And they pulled in, and I understand later, as I look back through it, there was 380 of them. And what they had done is they sent out word to MPs and different ones, and they had stopped these trucks on various places throughout France, made them unload, brought the trucks and trailers into our camp, and they gave us about 6 or 7 bales of straw for each trailer. which we threw in there and cut twine on them, spread them out. And it was around noon or so that we finally got started. But as I understand, that was one of the quickest mobilizations of a division there's ever been, because usually it takes about 2 or 3 months to get a division all squared away and get it rolling, and sometimes weeks just to get a division rolling. But anyway, what we were rolling in a matter of hours. I think we received the word like 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were loading on the trucks by noon. And we headed out. We didn't know where. And just a big convoy, trucks keeping their distance, and we just kept rolling. And we saw, as we got on, we saw evidence where the engineers had cut big trees and wedged them up. So we knew something big was up, because what they would do is be able to knock this wedge out and drop these trees across the road. So we knew that the Germans were on their way, and if they're going to take preparations this far back from the lines. So anyway, we kept rolling all the way through that day, and they didn't stop for a relief call. I mean, if a guy had to go, he just went over the tailgate, so the truck in the back kind of backed up a little bit. You know? But anyway, we had K rations, stayed on the straw, no blankets other than our seaborne rolls. We didn't want to unroll them. So we just huddled in the trucks, and it was cold. It was December, and finally night came on, and all the trucks turned their lights on. This was the first time that they had done this. They turned their lights on because they had to speed to make the best time, and they had to keep their distance, and they also had to see where they were going, so they turned all their lights on. And if there had been one German plane that had come over at that time, you're talking about 380 trucks, nose to tail, running down the road full of paratroopers, and one strafing run down something like that would have just about wiped out the 101st Airborne. But they had to take the chance. So we went, nobody knows today the exact route we took. There's been arguments on it and discussions. But I think, from what I understand, at the time we went through the old battlefields, World War I, and some of the evidence was still there, and we went on up through the night, and finally arrived at a little crossroad. Well, first of all, just before we hit that, we started hitting just thousands of men, virtually thousands of men coming back, running. A lot of them running, walking, taking jeeps or whatever they had, trucks, and they were retreating. And our convoy had come to slow down and stop, because sometimes the masses of humans, GIs on the road, was so great that the trucks couldn't move, and they was like lemmings. They wouldn't get out of the way. And we'd ask them, what's going on up there? And they said, we're going back and you're going up. You're all going to be killed. Yeah, but we kept moving until we finally came to a spot in the road where there was turn off to the right, and there was an MP shack there, and it was lit, had an electric light in it. And this big MP sergeant stepped out, and he said, 101st, and the driver said, yeah. He says, that way. He motioned to his left, which would have been our right, and we went into Bastogne. But before we got there, we ran into another roadblock, and we were held up for a couple of hours. And there was some captain of a heavy equipment company, and he had blocked the road. And he said that he had blocked the road, so he had people missing, and he wanted to get them. And that's the only way he could get them, was to block the road and make sure they didn't get by him. So our commanding officers, said that we were trying to get up to Bastogne to stop these Germans, and he didn't care. He was going to get his men. He didn't care if we moved or not, and he blocked the road with heavy equipment. Finally, one of our ranking officers came down and explained to him, and he gave a direct order. He said, you will get off the road now, or I'll have my men move you. Well, at this time, we were all yelling, shoot the son of a bitch, that captain. And if there hadn't been witnesses, I know one of us would have shot him, and then that would have got him off the road. But anyway, after the road was cleared and made him park all his big heavy equipment and vehicles over to one side, and we went on. And the truck came into a little town. I recall it very clearly. The name on the stone marker before you get into town was Champs, or Champs, or whatever they call it, Champs. And the truck drivers told us that they refused to go any further because the Germans were coming. And they knew it. So they allowed us to unload, and they did a 180 and headed back the other way towards France again. And we formed up and we started walking, and we walked in towards Bastogne. And later on that night, we walked up on another little side road and out into a large field. And we didn't bother taking anything out of our seaborne rolls again there, because we may have to move out at a moment's notice, and we didn't want to be sitting there rolling up blankets and shelter halves and whatever. So we laid down in the grass that was colder than the devil and wet, and laid there and shivered for the rest of the night like a bunch of dogs. Finally, before daylight, they rousted us up again, and we headed on the road towards Bastogne. And then we were ordered to leave our seaborne rolls on the side of the road in company and platoon formations. And I had a camera and several rolls of film in mine. I wanted to take it, but we didn't have time, so we stacked them. Then they told us, well, we'd pick our rolls up in a couple hours after we straightened out this mess. So anyway, we left our bed rolls, our seaborne rolls as we called them, and we walked into Bastogne. And it was 2 or 3 miles from where the trucks let us off into that point. And as we got into Bastogne, General McCullough was standing there, and he told Colonel Sink, the commanding officer of the 506, to send some men north and develop the situation. And that meant, keep going until you hit the enemy. So the 1st Battalion was sent to go north out of Bastogne. And we passed through Luzery, which is right on the outskirts of Bastogne, the north outskirts, and all the way up through Foy, and finally into Noville, which is 5 miles north of Bastogne. And before we got there, we were halted several times, and when we stopped on the going into Bastogne, there was no snow on the fields. But after we got into Bastogne, north of Bastogne, there was snow. And there was no snow before we got into Bastogne. There was no snow, no signs of snow anyplace. More damp and wet than anything. But after we passed through Bastogne, was going north of there, we ran into snow, and not a lot of it, maybe 3 or 4 inches of it. And we were called to a halt, and we rested for quite a while. And all this time, we didn't have enough weapons, and we had no ammunition to speak of. And one of the men in my squad, he had a big stick, and he would walk along, and he kept on this blacktop road that we were on in outer Champs, and he kept hitting the road with it. And he says, I'm going to have a rifle tonight. He says, this probably would be a Mauser, but I'm going to have a rifle. And those of us that did have a rifle, and I happened to be lucky enough, I had my .45 and I had an M1 rifle. But some of the men didn't have a rifle at all, or a carbine. But anyhow, we went in that way, and the ones that did have weapons didn't have the ammo. Hardly any grenades or anything. And so we went into heading north, and then we came to a stop. We rested for a while. And some of the men were dipping hands full of snow and eating it for something to do and try to quench their thirst, because when you start into combat, you get thirsty. Throat gets dry. And so Bilski was standing up on the edge of the road. There was a little embankment to the right, and Bilski was standing there. And suddenly his carbine went off, and when he looked he thought he shot himself through the foot. When he looked at his boot, he had cut a perfect half moon in the sole of his boot, but didn't touch any of the rest of the leather. And I said, it's too bad, Bilski. If you'd have shot yourself through the foot, you'd be going back to the hospital. He said, no. He said, the guy could be crippled like that. He didn't want to shoot himself through the foot. So anyway, after a while, we were marched out again, and before we got to Noville, there was a Jeep, and I understand, I discovered at a later date, this was a Lieutenant White of the 10th Armored, and he had taken it upon himself saying that we had no ammunition. He'd gone around to all the tankers and begged and borrowed their surplus that they had, and M1 ammunition, 45 grenades, and whatever else they had. Loaded up his Jeep, and he drove up ahead of us, and he was sitting in the middle of the road. And as we passed on either side, he would hand us ammunition and say, help yourself. But he said, leave some for the other guys. So each one of us took about 2 bandoliers of ammunition. And we were really relieved. And it was hell to go into combat with an empty rifle and nothing in your cartridge belt. So I had 2 bandoliers of ammunition, and most of the other guys did, and a few grenades. And at the same time, he asked me, he saw that I had a 45. He says, you want some ammunition for that? And I said, yeah. Well, he reached over and he had like a box of ammunition. He just had it loose, and he picked out a big double handful and handed them to me. And I put the 45 cartridges in my pockets. And we moved on, and finally came to another halt further on up the road. And by this time, we could hear a lot of gunfire going on up ahead, artillery shells exploding, small arms fired, rattling, and you could hear some American machine guns, which is a slower rate of fire. You know, they making their own particular sound, and then you hear the fast-ripping burps of German machine guns. We stopped on the side of the road, and along with some of the replacements that we got in of enlisted men, we did have some officers. Well, evidently we had an officer, and he said, well, we're going to go into combat. We're going to kick crowd butt, and we have to move fast. So he said, we can't be wearing these heavy overcoats and things. So he made us pull off in company formation of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd platoons. And we had to take off our overshoes, overcoats, gloves, wool scarves, and everything, and strip down to jump boots and jumpsuits. So then we moved out again, and these were stacked. These clothes were stacked alongside the road in piles that we would pick up again later, like we did we're supposed to pick up our seaborne rolls. So we moved out again towards Noville, and we came to a stop again, and the shells were coming heavy. And by this time, we got up close to the outskirts. And the elements of the 9th Armored had preceded us there by a day, and they were already in there, and they were fighting. And unbeknownst to us, they had stopped a pretty good German thrust at that time coming in down, I believe it was the Hoffeleis Road. And they stopped them on the outskirts there, and they dug in. Well, then the Germans that first hit them was waiting for all their other men to come in behind them, which they did, their tanks and their backup. And so as we got ready to go into Noville, the road teed off to the east, and I forget now whether it was B Company was going north and C Company to the east, and with A Company in the center, or whether it was C Company going north. But anyway, A Company was in the center of the attack. And as we started in, a lot of shelling came in. There was a man from the 9th Armored. He was in a Jeep, and he was killed. And he was still sitting behind the steering wheel, but his body hung head down out of the left side of the Jeep, and his blood ran into the ditch and had filled the ditch while it spooked some of the new replacements. But non-coms got him under control. We went on in. And then just as we started in the attack, A Company was to take the center, so I think 2nd Platoon was to lead off. Then, so Sergeant Vetlin turned around. He says, okay, Burgett and Phillips, you're out as, well, we used to call scout, now they call him point man. He said, Burgett and Phillips, your scout, move out. So we started out across the road where it came in on a fork, a Y shape. And then Phillips ran past me, and he ran up on the right side of the road. And that came in, adjoining the road that we just came in on. And then he cut across the road to the buildings, and there's some real heavy shelling started coming in. It was just about some of the heaviest shelling I've ever been in. And the buildings were being torn down, and shell fragments. You could see shell fragments hitting the stone walls and sparking, ricocheting around, and men were getting hit and killed. And so I cut across the road with Phillips right behind him, and we ran up using the buildings on our left as a shelter. And we ran all the way up into Noville, and we made our attack. And at that time, Don Burgett was our squad leader. And my squad was told to advance as far up that road and up to the crest and over. We got all the way up the road, and Phillips and I being out front, we ran to a little hog pen, or where we kept hogs that was made out of stone. We heard the shells coming in, we jumped in there, and of course the next volley of shells came in closer, so we ran out of that, and we was about halfway across the next shelter when that one was blown all to pieces, and we got in that one. We heard the shells, our guns firing again, so we ran from that one, and they destroyed about 4 of these little stone buildings that we were in, one after the other, as we'd leave them. So anyway, we finally led the way, and the 8th Company followed us until we got up to past the buildings and started out across the open ground, and there was a haystack almost halfway up this hill or incline. And we made our way up there, and then Brennenstuhl joined us, and there was Brennenstuhl and me and Phillips and Spear was underneath this haystack, and they kept firing at us, and of course there was tanks came over, backed up by infantry, and we was firing at the infantry. And finally, Brennenstuhl said, well, we can't go any further. The firing was too heavy, and there was tanks. We were facing tanks. And so we'll have to go, he told me to go back and see if we could withdraw from that position. And I ran back, and I found the company commander, and I didn't recall his name because he wasn't with us that long. He was wounded after that. And he said, no, we had to stay there. So I ran back and told Brennenstuhl, I says, the order is we had to stay. You couldn't withdraw from there. And about that time, a Tiger tank came over the crest and rolled right down to within, maybe 150 feet from us. And he opened up with a machine gun to set the haystack on fire. But we stayed there as long as we could, and chunks of burning straw started falling on our hay, started falling on our backs. And so Brennenstuhl said, well, we have to leave. It's every man for himself. So Phillips and Spear ran towards the back. I think Brennenstuhl ran towards the back of the houses too. And I ran down the main street of town the way we had come up. And I looked back, and this Tiger tank started up and started chasing me. And he could have killed me at any time. And that gives you a queasy feeling when you're running as fast as you can. You look over your shoulder and you see this big 88 pointed right at you, shoulder blades. Just as I reached the entrance to town, this red-headed captain stepped out with a carbine. And he had carbine at port arms, and he was from the armored. He stepped out and said, halt. I said, halt, hell, get out of the way. And he looked past me and saw that Tiger tank coming, and he jumped back in the doorway. And I went down about 3 or 4 doorways, and I ran through made the doorway, ran into the building, and Liddell was in there, and Phillips was in there. And I said, out the back, quick. So we ran out the back. I think all 3 of us went through the door at the same time. And we went right and left, and the tank pulled up and ran his muzzle of his 88 into the building, and he fired it. And so anyway, after he put it in reverse and pulled out of town, backed all the way. He never turned around. He kept the bow toward us, and he went backed up over the hill. And we went back into the building, and all the plaster was coming down like a fine snow. And there was an old dead civilian sitting in a big brass bed, or laying in a big brass bed, his body was. And to the room to the left, that he'd come in the front door. Well, the muzzle blast from that 88 just plastered him up against the wall, and he was kind of stuck there. And when we came back in, Liddell looked over and he said, boy, I hope his kinfolks don't think we done that to him when they come back here. And a little while later, Spirit came up and stuck his head through the window, and he says, "What did that tank do?" And I said, "What the hell does it look like?" He tore the hell out of that place. But anyway, we held there. The Germans made several other attacks. We had to move back out to the right again. It was coming on towards dark. And they attacked in force with tanks. They went over us. One German tank went over my head, and I believe it was a Tiger. But anyway, he stopped, and his metal tread was right over my head, just like the lid on a box, and I couldn't get out. It was in the foxhole, and it seemed like 30 minutes, probably about 3 seconds, but then he went on again. And he moved on. Evidently, he didn't see us there, and he went on, went into town, and there was some Shermans in there and some tank destroyers. Well, we heard the tanks firing back and forth, and anyway, the tanks finally withdrew again. It came on night, and they started shelling us real heavy. And they shelled us heavier than like I said, almost any shelling that I've ever been in up to that point. And finally, we took refuge in the cellar of a house. And when I went down there, I seen Vetlin was down there and several other troopers, and they had a candle for a light, and there was a woman, I imagine in her 30s, and a young man was with her. He was probably about 17 or 18. And there was an old woman. There was a bin over to one side of the cellar, and there was a bin full of sugar beets. And this old woman and 2 young kids, a boy and a girl, was laying on the sugar beets. The shelling was coming in, so everybody was turning the town down around us. And the old woman was crying all the time. This young woman, she was pretty steady, and she stood there with her arms folded. And the young man that was with her, this 17 or 18-year-old, he was very nervous, and she kept calming him, calming the old lady from crying. And the kids didn't cry as much as the old lady did. And anyway, we sat there, and Vetlin sat on a barrel or something. I know the barrel or a box now, but he sat there with his Tommy gun facing towards the top of the stairs. And I guess that was in case some of the Germans did make the town and did start down the stairs, he'd get the first shot. And so I said, "When are we going to leave?" He said, "You'd let us know." He didn't know himself. So anyway, we finally went out. Got the word, said, "Let's go out." So we scattered out in wherever foxholes we could find. And the shelling came in heavy, and the tanks started coming in, and the tanks were firing as it came in. Infantry, and it was foggy. Fog came down. And finally, it became so confused, and suddenly an order came up the line or down the line, and they said, "Withdraw." We had to pull out. So we started pulling out, and I know when I pulled out, I was all alone. I was running through the dark and the fog and the shells hitting, and buildings were being crumbled, and a lot of people were being killed, and I ran back towards the way we came into town. I got all the way back to the building where Colonel LaPrade was killed. He was in a building that he made his command post, where the roads forked, and he could stay in the building and look up and down all the roads in the center of Noville. And he was in there with Colonel Desiree of the 9th Armored. Well, the shell came through, or either came through the window or landed outside, and Desiree was wounded real bad, and Colonel LaPrade was killed. So I got back to there, and I was deciding whether to head back toward Bastogne down the main road that we came in on, and I was seeing other people that I didn't know. And finally, I went over and asked some guys, 2 guys in the foxhole. I asked who they were, and they said they were from the 9th Armored. And then some other guys, troopers, were coming back towards me from the main road, coming like from the Bastogne direction back into the center of town, and they said it was all a mistake, that there was to be no withdrawal, that we were to stay and hold and to return to our position. So we did. Turned around, went back, and we stayed in our positions till the next morning. And it was foggy, and there was so much fog it was like looking into a glass of milk. And Anyway, we could hear voices and couldn't tell where they were at. Finally, I got together with Spear, and we were in the same foxhole together. And we heard like explosions and things going on through the night. We heard the tanks moving in on us. You could hear the engines idling, and we knew they were maneuvering, and we knew there was a lot of tanks. But it's kind of hard to tell the distance and where they're at. But during that dark part, as long as the enemy has troops in your area, they don't throw artillery in because they're going to kill their own troops or knock out their own equipment. So the artillery had almost come to a stop, but we could hear all these tanks maneuvering. And during the night, we heard 3 distinct explosions of, I think it was a bazooka. And later, the following day, the word came down. I don't know if it was true or not because I never did ask Vetlin, but someone said that Vetlin had found a bazooka and went out and had hit at least 3 different tanks. He would go up close to them and hear the engines running, get close, and then name the bazooka and back off a safe distance and fire blindly through the fog. And it was reported that he hit 3 different tanks. But anyway, the daylight finally came and the fog was still there. And suddenly the fog lifted. It didn't dissipate or blow away with a breeze or a wind. It just lifted, just like a curtain on the stage, and it went straight up. And as it did, I looked out in the field in front of me, and I counted 32 German tanks sitting there. There was, closest one was within about 40 feet. And the tank commander was up in the turret, and he was talking on a radio. And I started taking aim at him, and Spear said, "No, don't. He'll know where we're at." Well, then I said, "Well, hell, that's what we're here for, And so I started to take aim again, and about that time, the tank commander dropped down through the hatch, and he buttoned up, so I didn't get a shot at him. And another tank to our left, which would be closer towards the center of Noville, he started backing up, and he spotted our positions. There was foxholes that we were occupying that we did not dig. They were dug by troops that was there before us. And he started firing into the foxholes, and he killed, out of Barrington was one of them. The young man that I helped, he was wounded in Normandy, and I helped bandage his arm. He was one of them was killed, and this tank was traversing his turret, firing rounds into the foxholes and killing nearly all of A Company. And Chmielewski jumped up and ran out towards the tank, firing his carbine at it. And the tank threw it in reverse and started racing backward. Well, then the other tanks went. And Chmielewski kept chasing that tank and firing, and the tank fired around at him with a cannon, and it just barely missed his shoulder, his head, and struck buildings in the back of us. And then they didn't fire anymore. They just kept running backwards. Several of the tanks did. And Chmielewski, finally, he was outdistanced by the tanks, and he came walking back. And there was no artillery hitting us at that time, no small arms fire, and the tanks were withdrawing. And Chmielewski was crying. And he says, "Why didn't somebody stop that tank?" And I looked at him, and he had tears running down his cheeks, because that tank had killed about half of A Company, and Chmielewski wanted his revenge on that tank, and he went after it with a carbine. And why the tank backed up, I don't know, unless they figured if he ever got on deck or got a rock between their bogey wheels, he was at their mercy, and he was mad. So anyway, he came back, and after that we had other fights there where we were overrun by tanks. We had shootouts, and we were being decimated. And finally, the order came down that we were to withdraw from Noville. It was that our military finally realized that we were in a bad position there, and it was of no military value to wipe out a whole company or a battalion just for the sake of say we stood out there. But anyway, we had orders to withdraw, and so we withdrew in orderly fashion. It was a long process where they took all the vehicles that could be moved, and there was an orderly withdrawal. It wasn't a retreat. And they put tanks up front, TDs, and we gathered up all of our wounded, and they were put we formed a convoy, and they were put near the center of the convoy for protection. And C Company led off on the point to leave Noville and go back to form a perimeter around Bastogne. And we started out in the convoy, and A Company was supposed to be the rear guard. We were the last ones to leave Noville, like the last man out, turn out the lights. But Noville was burning fiercely, and we had a bunch of German ammunition that was captured and explosives, and so we were trying to delay the German tanks from following us. So someone decided to try to blow the church steeple across the road. So they put a lot of the German explosives in the church and in the steeple, and piled all the captured German ammunition that they could on there, even shells from those knocked out German tanks and everything. And we started an orderly withdrawal. And there was one tank there. It was had a 10th Armored emblem on it that there was no crew. Evidently the crew had been killed or whatever. They may have even left at an earlier time. But anyway, paratroopers went down the armored infantry and tried to get someone to drive this tank, and they said they didn't know how. And the paratroopers got mad. They said, well, you're armored and you don't know how to handle a tank. Well, it was true. I mean, if a guy was armored infantry, there's no sign he knew the operation of a tank. He was just there to support them. But anyway, two of the paratroopers did get into that tank, and with half-track leading off, and the tanks, they started out of Noville back through Foy, and back towards Bastogne. Well, as we got towards Foy, we personally didn't realize that the Germans had already encircled Noville completely. And they pushed the 3rd Battalion of the 506 back from where their positions were, it wasn't Foy. And the Germans occupied Foy, not the 3rd Battalion. So we started down the road, and A Company had the job of being rear guard, and also we had to stay until the church was blown up and made sure that the explosives went off, the church was destroyed, and the steeple went across the road in an attempt to stop the Germans from following us. But whereas in reality, the Germans had gone around Noville, and they were already sitting waiting for us. So the tank that the 2 paratroopers was operating, there were several attempts made to get through Foy, and they were fired upon, the half-tracks and one thing and another. So these 2 paratroopers said, we'll get through the Foy. And they took the tank out, the Sherman they were in, and they went forward. Well, they were no match for regular tank crew. And there was three German tanks there. They drilled a round straight through that Sherman, and it blew up. Killed the 2 paratroopers and blew the turret off the tank. And I personally saw that turret go in the air, maybe 40, 50 feet, and it did a complete somersault and landed in the middle of the road upside down. And that blocked the whole road. We could not get the convoy down the road. And there's no way to move it. Turret, it's too heavy. And so they was afraid to go out through the fields because the ground wasn't frozen that much. They thought they'd stick the whole convoy. So here we were in the road, and the enemy coming down behind us and in front of us. And the TDs I was on, the church hadn't blown yet. And all of a sudden, one of the guys on our tank saw Germans running through the woods which would be to our right rear. And he said, let's get them. So we jumped off the TDs and went running back, jumped across the creek, and started up the hill where the Germans saw us coming, and they took off on a run. They left the area. So we stayed up there for a while, and finally this one, the convoy started moving out again. They started down through the field, and they found out that it would hold up the trucks and tanks, so they went through the field, going around this turret that was blocking the road. And so we ran, this young guy again said, or another guy said, we better get back in the convoy or we're going to be left behind. So we ran back down the hill and jumped the creek again and ran out to where the convoy was. And anyway, in the meantime, the church did blow up, but it didn't stop the Germans because they were already around Noville in force. So TDs that I was on, they were had already left, and they were going down the road, and they circled out through the field, and they were gone. And a 6x6 came by, and so I jumped on board. And just the driver, and it was an empty truck. And he said, "Hey, trooper, do you know how to use a 50 caliber?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, they just killed his machine gunner. His body fell out of the truck. So anyway, I took the machine gun, the 50 caliber, and I started raking the hills with it. And some of the Germans were starting to come over the hills, and we opened fire on them. And we literally shot our way out of that Noville. They had tanks firing at us, they firing mortars, and they firing artillery. And they're firing point blank the infantry from the hill and also from the ditches of the road. And we shot our way out of there. And this driver also suddenly looked at me, and an officer from the 9th Airborne came up, and he says, "Help me on board." And so I reached down and got him by the collar. He was trying to get on the back of the truck, and he couldn't. And come to find out, he said, "Well, the Krauts just shot me in the butt." The bullet went through the cheeks of his butt, and he couldn't raise his legs that high to get on board the tailgate of the truck. So I reached down, and I got off the machine gun, reached down, got him by the collar, and yanked him in the truck. And he rolled over the side, stuck his carbine through the slats of the truck. And then he began firing at the Germans, and I ran back up to the machine gun. I just operated the machine gun then. This young driver said, "Well, here's where we make it or we don't." And he angled the truck, and we were going to the west of Foy on a road that went out to Racon, which was the next town. We hit the embankment on an angle, went up and kind of slid around and went down the other side and crossed the field, and we joined the convoy. I was gathering on the other side, but it was all broken up by this time with no point of order in the march. But anyway, by this time it was dark. Noville was burning, blazing, lit up the whole area, burning to the ground, and you could still smell the powder. The shells were coming in, and so we took the convoy from that point from Noville back towards Bastogne. And when we got, just before we got back to Bastogne, it was dark, like I said, and you could see Noville burning in the rear. And the men were running alongside some of the vehicles and doing whatever they could. It was all withdrawing from Noville. By this time, it was kind of an orderly chaos, I might say, but the men were still staying together, could still operate as a fighting unit, but still we were all mixed up. People I didn't know, armored men, paratroopers. We got to the outskirts of Losery, and I heard somebody yelling, "A company, get off here, A company, assembled here." So I told this driver, I said, "This is where I get off," and I jumped off the truck, and it was Bethan. He was standing alongside the road. He had his helmet off in one hand, and he had his Tommy gun in the other hand. He was saying, "A company." He looked at me, he said, "Oh, Burgett, you're still alive." And I said, "Yeah, still alive in here." So anyway, we assembled there. And then after a while, we marched out from there after the convoy went by. And that's kind of a lonely feeling. You're standing there in the dark with survivors and some of them wounded. And then you see the last tailgate go down the road, and they go back into Bastogne and shut the door. And you're outside there, and they said, "Now guard us, So there we are standing alone out in the dark, no overcoats, no overshoes. The temperature dropped to 5 below. And they told us that we had to meet at a barn at Losery. So we marched back there, and we started to stay in the barn that night. And I don't know who it was, came in and said they needed someone on a machine gun out on the railroad. And I was just piling up a bunch of straw and trying to figure out, well, at least I'll get some night I sleep tonight in the barn. Then guess who they picked to go on the machine gun? It was me and Liddell and Benson and Spear. So we went out to the machine gun and we had to stay there a whole night. And then we were supposed to have relief in the morning, but early in the morning before daylight. But someone came out to us and said, well, they couldn't give us relief. We had to spend the rest of the day there. And we did see German Tiger tank come out. And he was on the other side of the tracks, the east of the tracks, and he came out and they had a bunch of men around him, and he stayed for a while, and then he went back in and backed into the woods again, and he came out. He did this about 4 times. And, of course, if he ever decided to come over us, he could have, a 30 caliber machine gun, and the first of the Tiger tank, he'd have walked all over us. But anyway, he finally backed in the woods, and we didn't see him anymore, and then finally we did get relief. And we had a bottle of cognac out there, which Benson had, and he produced it, and we started taking drinks out of it, and got to Liddell, who was a Mormon, and he'd take his share of the drink, and he'd pour it on a little piece of rock that he had, and it lighted the one of his fingers. But anyway, we finally left there and got back to the building, a farm building, and there was a kitchen there, and it was warming ourselves, and anyway, General McCullough came out, and he had an officer with him. And so he told us that we were completely surrounded, and that we had an ultimatum to surrender, and so asked us how we felt about it. And a lot of guys said, well, tell them to go F themselves, sir. And he started laughing. He said, that's about what I did tell him. He said, but he said, I knew what my answer would be, but I had to come out and ask you guys anyway. So he got in his Jeep and left. And so anyway, we were called out, went back to the barn. We started cooking something to eat out of our K-rations. We were handed a box of K-rations when we entered the barn. And we built a little fire on the barn floor. And there, we raked all the straw back so it wouldn't burn the barn down. And then, again, Vetlin came in. He was our platoon sergeant, so he was always the one to give us our orders. And said some Germans had broken through our lines, came through the 501 lines, which we discovered later they didn't. They walked down the railroad track. And since we were put in reserve because we were so shot up, that, I think I'll call it quits for this. I got a drink of water or something. Pop, do you drink pop or Snapple or what was your... Well, pop's all right. That,
You like root beer, red pie, rock and ride.
rock and ride is okay.
See, sorry, I don't have any food here.
Oh, that's all right. Ooh, boy. That took a smell.
Glass, or do you want to drink?
No, this is all right. This is fine. Thank you.
Yeah, let's suggest an intermission right at this place. Anyways,
I forgot to mention that what caused it down. So, that tank, the German tank that came into Noville. But anyway, he came in and there was a Sherman. He had been crippled and he backed in between two houses there. And the big Tiger came all the way in. Right down the same road that I was chased down. And this was later. And he pulled all the way in there and he just as he got in front, this guy was backed in this way and this guy came down this way. And the main road was here. And when the Tiger tank got right in front of him, he was about 30 feet in front of him, that Sherman hit him 3 times and didn't hurt him, about 30 feet. And so the Tiger tank backed up and get out of town. But anyway, that was one of them. They kept penetrating our lines with these tanks. They kept coming in over us and around us and through us and whatever they wanted. It was foggier than hell.
So when you were in Noville, part of the time you were dug in a hole, and part of the time you were in a cellar. But
I was in the cellar about, I would imagine, maybe 2 hours.
when that tank rolled over your hole, was it daylight or nighttime?
That was, Jesus, I think it was partly night. It was just in that limbo period.
It was just foggy, though. Is that why?
Yeah.
Do you think he wasn't aware that you were there? Because
Well, if he'd have known we was there, he would. If he'd have known I was there, he would have crushed me. He'd have just locked his tread and turned around.
so
He
it
didn't
was
see
either the fog or the darkness or something that saved you there from being discovered.
Oh, the other thing I was going to tell you too, when just before those tanks, during that, remember I said when they had that heavy shelling coming in, I did, yeah, God, like I said, you go back and all of a sudden I should have really refreshed my memory. The shelling was so heavy that I was, I jumped in a slit trench, and I was blown out of the slit trench 3 times, almost in rapid succession. I went out and I rolled back into it. I heard more shells coming. They went just over my hole. I was blown out again. I rolled back into it, and I blew it out the 3rd time. It tore my sleeve on the left side, burnt the hair on the left side of my face. And I could tell that later, just go back to it. But anyway, the shelling was coming in so heavy, and that I finally left the slit trench. I figured, what the hell, one of these shells going to land direct, and I ran back. Next to there was a big ditch. There was a whole bunch of guys in there, a bunch of paratroopers. And Gaddy was one of them. And there was a young guy, like a battalion descent. He came running around drilling. The shelling was really coming in heavy. You couldn't believe it. It was awesome. And they came running around the building that we were up against. And his intestines were out, and they were dragging. He was holding, and Gaddy ran out and tackled him, and I helped him. And I put my raincoat. We always carried a raincoat on the back of the belt. I put my raincoat down, and we laid his intestines on there. We took the big stones off of him and took our canteens and washed the rest of the gravel off, and we put them back inside them.
Was he an armored guy or
No, he was a paratrooper.
but you're not somebody you knew?
Yeah, he was a new replacement in my squad.
Place.
Yeah, he was in my squad. I can't think of his name.
Did you take him out?
One of these guys that came in, he was there for 24 hours and he's gone.
Did you take him out when the withdrawal was made?
Yeah, I imagine. See, once they became wounded, they put him in a shelter, and so they did load all the wounded on the vehicles. So I imagine he was loaded on one of the vehicles.
When these shells came in close and blew you out of your hole, did they make your nose and the ears bleed and things like that? Or
It probably did. I didn't. It was all burnt and everything, so
because I've had guys say their blood was running out of their ear.
Yeah.
Some of them can't hear good to this day.
I can't off my right ear. My right ear is. That's why some of that I was what? Like a chicken turned their head.
Somebody from 502S2 told me something interesting the other day. He got shot with Schweizer bullets in his hands, 2 in one hand, 1 in the other. And aim it, and the German beat him to it. The stock of his Tommy gun was tore up. Anyways, there was 3 field hospitals in and around Bastogne, and one was at an old rifle range that was west of town, near Hemrule. And there was a lot of 327 and 502 guys in there. Anyways, he was in there lying on the floor, and one of the nights when they were bombing Bastogne, when Big Five, it was right around Christmas too. He said the concussion of the ground was so great it was hurting his body.
Yeah.
You could feel those bombs go off. And then one of the guys with him said, "Do this." And he got on his stomach and he raised up on his elbows and elevated his body up and down so that it was easier to take the concussions he could have been going through his body. But
See, those guys got more bombing than we did. See, most of those guys were right in Bastogne itself, whereas we were on the outer perimeter. See, we were like in the little town, like Foy and Louisville, whatever. And around Bastogne, we never did get too much into Bastogne itself.
Well, these guys are on the west perimeter. They were outside the town, but I guess more bombs fell close to where they were, And of course, there was a hospital right on the main street in Bastogne, with just another building, a solid row of buildings. And the Germans happened to drop a bomb right out. That was the 10th Armored Division's hospital.
Yeah, I heard about that.
That's where that girl got killed at Resupply out there.
And it burned all those guys in it. But we were north of Bastogne, and then we went south, west.
Shit.
On Christmas Day, we went west. He set up in the field.
Good.
That's where we were at when the skies cleared and they dropped the supplies.
You were west of the city then?
Yeah.
West of Bastogne. I didn't know that.
Most kind of northwest. See, we came down. So it came down from Noville into Louisville, and then from Louisville, we didn't go into Bastogne, we cut across, and this other road came out, and we went up this road.
Is that the road that goes through Recon there? And,
no, Recon is, it may, if it gets up far enough, it go to the west.
Because there is a road that skirts north of Bastogne that goes through Recon to Noville and comes out there in water shops.
Yeah, well, that may be it, but it's, it comes right out of Bastogne. If you're looking at Bastogne, it's here, and then Louisville, and then Foy and Noville. That's going up this way, and then the Hoffalide Road comes off this way. But we came down, and then this road comes up on an angle this way out of Bastogne, and Champs is down here. We came in this way, but this road goes up, and we were up a little ways on that, and we were in the woods, and there was a house. A white house sitting out. Now that's in that picture where the plane came down and crashed and skittered across, and it's in the field. And there was a white house sitting out there. Well, from the road, the ground was elevated, came back, and then it dropped off into an embankment about 3 or 4 feet. And that's where all the pine trees were, and a little creek in there. And that's where this colored outfit was in there. They were on 155, but they didn't have any ammo. And they had left Bastogne, and General McCullough, he's an artilleryman, he sent somebody after him and made him come back. And he set them up there. Well, they expended their ammunition on the first day or two.
They call themselves High Price on the radio. That was their code.
Oh, yeah?
Black 155. And I know they killed 3 guys from C Company 501 accident. They fired some short rounds out, and they were way over near Neff on the east side of town. One of their platoon leaders, this guy, go back and kill him. He started back with his Tommy gun, but he was too far away.
Well, we were right next to him.
Okay, and they were kind of north or northwest of town. Yeah.
And we were talking to them because their dugout they dug in. They had timbers and everything set up for a real nice dugout, and they had coffee and everything, and shit. We were out in the open with nothing, So anyway, that's when we took turns at night on machine guns, and because the Germans attacked, the machine gun could hold them off for 3 or 4 minutes. That it'd take everybody to become awake, and aware of what's going on. So we always kept 1 or 2 guys on machine gun, and one of these colored guys came out. They had a room dug there, biggest like from here to there. They had bunks in there and everything, coffee. And so anyway, one of them came out during the night and went down in front of the machine gun. Thomas was on the gun, and he went down there to take a crap or something, And so anyway, we always used a password, and they didn't. We used a challenge and a password. I don't remember what it was that night because it was passed verbally every day. And so anyway, this guy went down. He was coming back up, and we could hear Thomas. We was all aware that this guy went down there, And anyway, come tromping back up there, and old Thomas, just like the movies, halt, who goes there? Hey, man, it's me. He said, what's the password? He said, man, I don't know there's no password. He said, sound off for the password. He said, I'm going to cut you in half with a machine gun. He said, don't shoot, boss. There's no nigger Nazis. We all started laughing. And you could hear him yelling all the way through the woods. He said, don't shoot, boss. There's no nigger Nazis.
Is that the same black outfit that gave you the hot shower, or was that another one that came in?
Was another broke through. That was another outfit.
Okay, that'd be a good story to tell on the outfit.
Well, they didn't give us a hot shower, but they fed us.
Yeah, hot shower, I said, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's what I said, hot shower. Yeah, hot chow.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we got back to that monastery, they did feed us. And it kind of pissed me off because we went up to the white guy, and the guy said, I got just enough food for my own. He said, so we went over to this guy come back, he had a mess kit, and we always carried our mess kit, you don't lose that. And so he had pancakes and sausage and eggs and all kinds of stuff. And Jesus Christ, we hadn't seen nothing like that, where the hell did you get that? And right over there, this colored guys, and we didn't know whether to go over or not, but we did. When finally, hungry enough, we went over. Well, all these colored guys, they stopped. I said, go ahead and eat. I said, take anything you want. And I said, well, we don't want to take your food. And they said, hey, we eat every day. You guys have it. And it kind of puts a different perspective on this thing sometimes. Than this.
Well, in George's book on Bastogne that just came out, he interviewed a lot of troop carrier guys, and they said that flying those resupply missions at Bastogne was the most murderous flight that they ever experienced. It was worse than the Army. It was way worse than the Holland resupply flights, and a lot of them were shot down.
I know they were.
One of the 506 guys from D Company I interviewed said he saw one come out of a plane that was being shot down, and he pulled his ripcord too quick, and his chute caught on the tail of the plane, and he was going down with the plane, and he broke free of it before the plane crashed, but he had a streamer, and he said he actually saw the guy hit the ground and bounce. Then they went over to him, he was still alive, and he said as far as he knows, the guy survived because they evacuated and come out of there. But someone from 501 told me they saw the same guy catch on the tail of the plane as it was going down. They just assumed that he died in the plane. Frank Ness, who was a supply sergeant at the D Company 506, he saw the guy get the bounce and survived. So
I saw a movie just the other day. Went over to my buddy's house, Al Kovac, and he had this movie on about all about airborne and skydiving. The guy's all this skydiving or this guy, he was air rescue. They dive, like seals, you dive in water or whatever. And he made a jump, and geez, he hit another guy. Another guy went through him or something and collapsed the chutes anyway. The other guy went through, and I think the other one survived, but his chute collapsed and became a streamer, and he went all the way down. And Jesus Christ, the camera was right there. It's a practice jump, and he hit. You see the guy coming out and whack. He hit there. Well, do you want to do some more of this?
yeah, you ready to tell the story about Losery? Or in fact, this thing was running. I didn't know it while you were talking just now. I wonder if I should save it or if I go back. Well,
okay. When we got back to the barn, what we did is we all the guys got together and kind of swept a wide circle out of the middle of the floor, the dirt floor. So we got all the straw away from the center where we built a small fire, a smokeless fire. And the reason we did that is to keep it straw from catching on fire and burning the barn down. And most of the guys slept on the outer perimeter of the barn, like up near up in the hay mow and different places like that. So they stayed away from the center. And we were issued a box of K rations apiece when we entered the barn door. And so we sat down, we started heating our coffee first, and water from our canteens, and making K-ration coffee, and getting ready to eat something. And there again, when Veteran came in and said, well, there was some Germans that got infiltrated the 501 lines and was behind our lines. And we learned at a later date that this was not true, that the Germans came right down the center of the railroad track. The 501 lines was supposed to make contact with the 506 lines, but actually the 501, that's at the railroad track. But the 501, their lines that got to the railroad track where they expected to find the 506, and they were further north, and the 506 was further south, so the two lines overlapped and actually didn't meet, and the Germans walked right down the center of the track. And I discovered later, I figured there was about 175 Germans there, but I discovered later that there was around 250 of them, and they were from the 26th Volksgrenadiers. But anyway, we were assigned the task of getting them out of there, and since we were the only ones in reserve at this time, they couldn't pull men off the 501 lines or the 506. So the 1st Battalion, being shot up so bad in Noville, was put in reserve. Now we were the ones that was assigned to get them. And I believe at that time we had only 58 men left in A company. Yeah, let's see. Well, anyway, we were ordered to go up and get these Germans. Like I said, I think they were the 26th Volksgrenadier, and so we marched out in C Company. Since there's only about 58 of us, C Company was put with us to kind of beef us up, and so we marched out. And I think, if I recall correctly, I could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that C Company led off. We went kind of what we always call cattywampus across the fields. That is, cutting on an angle. Well, we cut on an angle till we hit the main road, and we lined up there, and in battle formation, never getting like you would in barracks conditions where you'll march with, like 15 yards or so between men on either side of the road. And this time we all stayed on the right side of the road, and we marched north. And it seems to me that C Company was in front of us, and we got, was called to a halt at the Bojac woods, which is just north of Luzerne. And we were in automatic line of skirmish, so we did a right face. And then at some signal, which I never did hear or know, they just said, let's go, and we moved into the woods. And at this time, we did take turns at being, as I said, scout, which is point man. And then again, this time Phillips and I led into Noville, so as point men. And so he picked Spear, Cyber Spear from New York. And oh boy, now all of a sudden
That's an Alvarado.
Well, I don't know. Mind going blank here. A lot of things to remember all at one time. But anyway, Alvarado and Spear. Now, Spear, he could spot a German for a mile, it seemed like, in any kind of condition. So, but he always made the mistake of saying, there they are, and pointing to try to warn us or his men around him. What I've always told him, I said, Spear, just fire, shoot at him. Whether you hit him or not as infantry, but go down, get out of the way. And everybody else will hit the ground at the same time. When the shot goes off, everybody's going to hit, and they'll know the enemy's there. But he always yelled, there they are. Well, he did the same thing this time. We moved in skirmishers, and I believe C Company was to our far left. Borelli had his platoon to the left of the second platoon, and we went into the woods. Suddenly, Spear said, there they are, and he was pointed, but beyond another German we didn't see for some reason. Well, they were well camouflaged in white, and this man was just about 20 feet in front of him. And the man shot Spear right through the mouth, Of course, it tore his back of his neck out, his spine. He was dead before he hit the ground. And as the German worked his bolt, Alvarado had carbine, and he shot the German. Of course, I never had much faith in the carbine. But the German finished slamming the bolt home and shot Alvarado. The impact of the bullet hit Alvarado so hard that the carbine flew out of his hands, and as he was going down, he yanked his knife out of his sheath on his leg, and he jumped forward the 2 or 3 steps, whatever it took, and he killed the German finished killing the German with a knife. And then we all started into it, but since Spear and Alvarado were standing between us and the German, we couldn't fire because they were blocking us. They were between our fire and the enemy. But when they were both killed, we went forward and in the attack. And this was kind of a vicious attack, hand to hand. Well, there was 58 of us, and I don't know how many men from C Company joined us. Never did know how many they had, maybe 20, 30 or whatever. There was just a platoon of them. We went into the attack, and we met the Germans head on, and there is another little story. Jerry James of Wyandotte, Michigan, when we were in Noville, there was a half track was hit and was burning, and he jumped on this burning half track, and on a pedestal mount, he wrestled the 50 caliber machine gun off of it. And we tried to talk him out of it because the half track was burning and could explode. But anyway, he finally managed to get it free of the pedestal mount. Took it on his shoulder, and we said, oh, it's too big. We couldn't even carry the darn thing. It's about 6 feet long. But he said, I'll carry it. You guys get the ammunition. So I grabbed a box of ammunition. I think Trotter grabbed a box. A couple other guys grabbed. We all took ammunition for it. But Jerry James actually carried this big 50 caliber on his shoulder. When we went in the attack in the Bojac, which is Jack's Woods, he put a scarf around the barrel, and he would fire this thing from the hip position, which I know there will be a lot of people, in fact, almost everybody I know, say you cannot do this. But Jerry James was a big man, a good man, and he was stout, and he did fire that 50. I saw him. It's history. He fired that, and he watched the tracers and squirted it like a hose, watching the tracers, and he would fire this big 50. And then to his right, which would be, and to my left was Jack Bram. He had a 30 caliber light air cool, which weighs 42 pounds, and he had a belt of ammo around his neck, and he was firing that from the hip. And he kept moving forward, and he suddenly had a big anger, like he didn't have it in Northern Holland, but he started yelling, I'm a Jew, you goddamn Krauts, I'll kill everyone, and come on, I'm a Jew. And he kept firing, and he's moving forward. And then to my direct front was Bilski, and he had a 30 caliber light air cool, and he was firing. He had a tripod on his, but he would pick it up and fire and run with it and set it down and fire.
Clean.
And the way we worked from their past experience, like the machine gunners, they would fire. We laid down a heavy field of fire, and they would move forward. And then they would kind of flop down, and they would open up with the machine guns, and we'd run through their lines, so that, between them and out in front of them, and then we'd again fire, and they would fire, and then they would leapfrog past us, and we'd leapfrog past them. And at one point, our attack died down, and I slid into a small, shallow spot, and Liddell was in there. Yeah, we both rolled over on our backs, and Liddell, he's always calling me Donnie Boy. And he said, well, Donnie Boy, he said, we're in it now, we're amongst them. That was one of our favorite sayings, say we're amongst them. And as we lay on our back, a tracer bullet, which was nearly spent, stuck in the tree between our heads, and it was spewing these little sparks out. And we watched the sparks, and he said, well, it's time to leave this spot. So he took off and ran. And when he did, I thought he had kicked me as he took off on the run. Well, I later discovered that night that I had a bullet stuck in my hip bone down there. And it wasn't all the way in. I was able to take it out. It was just about as spent as the bullet that stuck in the tree. And so anyway, he took off on the run, and the attack gained momentum again. And so there was, this one guy, he was wrestling with this German. We were in hand to hand, and he went end over end and down a hole, and he was trying to chew this German's throat out, and the German was trying to choke him, and I was trying to get a shot at either one of them. It seemed like with my 45, but anyway, this trooper gouged this German's eye out, and he killed the German, and gouged it out with his thumb. And we went on with the attack, and right then was when I went around towards the right, and I saw a young German. Well, he came up on him so close that I didn't think I could miss. He was within just 2 steps of me, so I just raised up with the M1 rifle without aiming. I fired point blank at him. Well, it turned out that I did miss, and he fired at me with his rifle, and he cut my chin strap off right here. So the end of the buckle flipped up and hit me in the eye with such an impact that I was knocked down. And I thought the bullet had passed through my head. And he raised up out of the hole and cranked the bolt. And I knew he was going to give me another shot. And I was face down, and I could watch him under the rim with my helmet. Borelli's platoon was coming around our left flank, and evidently he saw some of the men running, so he swung to his right, which would be to my left, and he fired. Well, he did that, and by the time he was trying to crank the bolt, I brought my M1 up, and I shot it through the left cheek here, and it came out and it took his whole right ear off. You could stick a coffee cup in the hole there. But I ran the 2 or 3 steps to him, and I know it impacted him pretty heavy. And he went down, straight down the hole, and I ran to him, and I was surprised at my strength because I reached down in the hole, and I grabbed him with my left hand, and I pulled him right out of the hole and threw him down on the edge of the hole there. And I used him like a sandbag, and I laid my rifle across him, and I shot at 2 more Germans. And about that time, Dobrik, over to my left, he fired at a German running from our right to the left, and the bullet struck that German, and that German burst into flame from head to toe. He fell in the snow burning. And of course, Dobrik, he's always coming up with it. He said, "You see that? You see that?" And this German, evidently, he must have had a Molotov cocktail on him, for tanks. And the bullet probably went through it, and somehow it ignited. But anyway, the German body, when he fell, he didn't scream or nothing because the bullet hit him solid, and he went down, but his whole body burst into flame. And we went on with the attack, and Bilski, like I said, the machine gunners were running between us and we between them, and we was going up forward with our attack. And there was Bilski had fired the last round out of his one belt, and he did something that he knew better as an experienced machine gunner. He raised up on his knees, opened the top of the machine gun. He started laying the new belt in there, and I was just to the right rear of him, and the bullet struck him in between the eyes, and I saw the vapor come out of the back of his head through his helmet. And he stayed on his knees with a real surprised look on his face for about to count to 3, and all of a sudden he collapsed with a gun. Bilski was a very good, very, very good friend of mine, and about the time I collected myself and I started to jump for the gun, another trooper slid in from the left, and he said, "I'll take the gun, I'll take it." And he finished loading the gun. He rolled Bilski's body off of it, finished loading the gun, slammed the cover down, and opened fire. In the meantime, I saw some Germans up ahead behind a log or something. I don't know if it was a log or an embankment, something that they'd put there. It was natural there, but anyway, I started firing on them. I seen a couple of them go down, and I knew that these were the men, probably one of them, that shot Bilski. And so we went on with our attack to the left, and then we got out to the end right near the railroad embankment where the 501 was on the other side. well, we heard a lot of shooting on the other direction in the 501, and I guess a lot of the Germans who had retreated from our attack had gone to the other side, and the 501 was knocking them off and capturing whatever surrendered. But one German jumped up in this little roadway that ran alongside the railroad track, and he was running down this little lane when our bazooka man happened to be out. And this was the unique thing about this particular fight. There was all small arms fire, knives, small arms, rifle, carbine, pistol. And I don't even recall a grenade having been used, and there was no mortars, no artillery, no nothing like that. And when this bazooka man saw the German running down the road and away from this, trying to escape it, just instinctively, he raised up with a bazooka and fired a rocket at it. Well, the rocket evidently hit behind him, and from the dust and the smoke and the dirt that it threw up, it obliterated the German for just enough, but when it cleared, he was gone. He was probably in the next county by that time. But that was the only biggest weapon used in that Bojac fight, was when that bazooka was fired. Everything else was small arms. And like I said, knives, hand-to-hand fighting, and that. It was pretty rough. We assembled back towards the center after we realized all the Germans were either dead or wounded. And
Yeah.
there was, I'll tell you what, one German was lying in it's like a slit trench, and I was getting out of it, I guess, mentally, because everything had just closed in on me. And for some reason, all the attacks that I've been in, and every time it was over with, I've always been able to stand there and look around. I could smell the burnt powder, and you could smell like raw iron and worn human blood, and see the flesh, torn flesh, and splinters of bone where the leg used to be. And I'll always be able to stand there, and you're the only one standing there, you and a couple other guys, and I'm always one of them. And I started thinking, why me? Why am I always one of them left? And all the communication wire, the limbs were down, the smell. You never forget the smell. And I suddenly took aim at this young man in the hole, and he started crying. He said, a bit, next sheesh, and I was going to kill him. And suddenly Phillips came up, and I looked at him, and I said, you still alive? And he said, yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. I said, one of us should be dead by now. And both of us did survive the war. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm just going to kill this kraut. He said, no. He said, he's too badly shot up. Leave him alone. So he reached down and pushed the barrel of my rifle down. And then another German came from the left, and he was an older man. He surrendered. He was shot in the leg. And so a guy walked up behind me, another paratrooper, and says, he's got a Luger? And I said, no. And kablam, he shot the German. And the German thought I shot him because he surrendered to me. And he started swearing at me. And so anyway, he died, and there was just a lot of deaths in that one area, a lot of carnage, a lot of unnecessary killing. And it seemed like everything just finally came in on both sides. The Germans were being really vicious at this time, and we were too. And so we made after we cleaned up in that area and made sure there was nobody left alive, like I said, it was going down. It was down below zero, and the wounded would have died anyway. So there was more or less like mercy, killing and doing them a favor, to take care of all the wounded, rather than leave them lay there to freeze to death. And then we left there, and we made a right turn, far sweeping right turn, and 180, and we were heading back towards the road. And most of the platoon was over to my right rear. Brendastow was up to my left front, and Horn was to my left rear. But he was in line. He was more like between Brendastow and me. As we started back towards the road, a machine gun burst came out, and bullets ripped right between all three of us, about head high. And of course, we hit the ground, all three of us. And at about that same time, another burst started, but the gunner evidently lowered the gun. And we seen the bullets striking the snow, and they're like in geysers. And they fast stitching walk right towards us. So the German gun and like that, you know. And the Brennenstuhl, he yelled at me, he said, "Roll, Burgett, roll." And he started rolling to his left, and I rolled to my right. And just as I did, I rolled about 15 feet real quick. And I looked back, and I saw Horn. He didn't roll at all. And he stuck his head up from the prone position, and the bullets caught him square in the face. He dropped, and then he raised his head up again. His face was just a mass of blood, and he put his hands up to his face, and I saw the blood squirting between his fingers, and he cried a little bit, and then he dropped dead. And I looked up ahead, and I saw Brennenstuhl had already started firing on the Germans on the machine gun. And I started firing, and I saw two of them just to my right of the gun, which would be to their left. And I hit two of them there. I was seeing them go down. And then we started receiving a lot of fire from our right flank. And about that time, Jack Bram had gotten up there, Jerry James, Phillips had swung to the right, Dobrik, and all the rest of the guys, and we opened fire into these Germans, and pretty soon they started yelling, "Comrade, comrade," and so we stopped shooting, and we told them to come on out, and they said they couldn't. They said they're all wounded, and none of them could walk. So Jack Bram says, "Well, you come on out, or we're going to start firing again." So they said they'd send one man out, and as the German came out, a non-com, and he was in a sitting position. His legs were all shot to pieces, and he propelled himself by pushing himself backwards with his hand. He kept looking over his shoulder at us. And he said all his men were shot up real bad, and they couldn't get out or walk or anything. So Jack Bram, he spoke a little German. He kept yelling, "Come and see Hitler." And they, of course, none of them could. Come here, and they couldn't get up. So we walked in finally, and we didn't want to walk into a trap, but we walked in there, and they were all shot up. And so anyway, we broke up all our weapons. We were short of weapons and supplies, but we still broke up their weapons. And this young hillbilly guy, he took a Schmeiser, and well, actually, it wasn't a Schmeiser. It was one of those, what we call the Buck Rogers gun. What is it, with a fully automatic with a long banana clip on it? And he took that, and he loaded it, and he fired a burst out of it to make sure it worked, and he leaned it against the tree. And he looked at this German non-com. He said, "This is for you." And so they asked us to take them with us as prisoners, and we said we couldn't. We have no facilities for taking care of prisoners, and so we left. And then this young hillbilly guy, I don't even know his name now, but he leaned this machine gun up against a tree about 50 feet or so away from these Germans. He was one of the Germans, so we walked out of there, and we were about 300 yards from there, and all of a sudden we heard this machine gun going off. It was that non-com killing his men rather than freeze to death. So we walked out of there, and it got real quiet. But even the firing from the 501 area got quiet. I guess they did receive a lot of fire, more so than from just the Germans that were retreating from us back there. Evidently, the Germans knew that their men that was in behind our line was in trouble, and they were trying to break through to help them. But when everything got quiet, they stopped. It was one of those weirdest things that happens in combat sometimes. There was total silence. There was so much silence that a ringing would start in your ears. There was no shots, no birds. It was deep snow, so we were making no sound while we walked. A big silver dollar snowflake started coming down, and it was just quiet. And it was just Christmas Eve, I think. Just about that time, we said, "Well, peace on earth, goodwill toward man." But we walked out of there, and got back to the road, and we walked back to the barn, illusory. And then we sat down. I sat down, and we built another little fire, and I saw Spear's coffee cup sitting there, and I turned around, and I said, "Hey, you better push your cup up, now." So I realized he was gone, and he's dead. And Goodbratson was there, and he was sitting across from me, and he told me later, he said he never seen such a shocked look on a man's face in his life as when I turned around and I realized the spear was dead.
Just barely get some sleep on? Or what?
No, we never did. From the time we got off the trucks to the time we slept for 3 or 4 hours in the field that night, and then we walked into Bastogne. We walked north to Noville. We fought there through that day, that night. The next day we fought our way out of there and then into back to Louisville. And then I was on the machine gun all night, and we never got 5 minutes of sleep at any time. We didn't receive that. There's no way we could in a position to go to sleep. No sleep at all. Our battle in the Bojac was on, I believe, the 21st. So we spent the next 21st, and then I did get some sleep finally. By the time we detrucked and had that 2 or 3 hours sleep in the field. All this time without sleep until finally, I think it was after the 21st and about the 22nd that I was able to get about 3 hours sleep on the side of the barn. Somebody had piled straw up, and I slept in that. And then on the 25th, we were ordered to move to another place. We pulled out of Louisville and back toward Bastogne. But before we got to Bastogne, we cut across fields again. One thing, hit another road that's running would be northwest out of Bastogne. And we moved up that road for a ways, and we stayed in a bivouacked in a field, not in the field itself, but there was a house up near the road, and it was a big cultivated field which was now covered with snow, and we went back a ways toward into the wooded part, and that's where we stayed. And there was a little creek in there, and there was I don't know, it would be a company, a battalion or what, battery of colored guys that was on the 155s, and they were bivouacked there, and they were out of ammunition. They'd expended all what they did have on the first couple of days, and so they were dug in, and that's where they stayed. So we stayed there for a while. But this is the point in time that was on the 25th. It was in the afternoon or midday, when all of a sudden the fog just quit. It just went away. And the sun was shining. And for all these days we've had fog, and fog so thick sometimes you could stick your rifle out and you couldn't see the front sight, and then other time you'd see shadowy figures, and other times it was just overcast and you could see a way, but it was just overcast and dark and dreary. And all of a sudden, it's hard to describe, but you didn't see the fog leave or see it lift, or it just was gone, and the sun was shining. And we were in the pine trees and the spruce, and you see the shafts of sunlight coming down through the trees into the dark areas, and it was, everybody just stood there and looked at it. Couldn't believe it. The sun was shining. And short time later, we could hear all these aircraft engines, just hundreds of them. And so finally the first wave of planes came over, C-47 Goonie birds, and they we had some signalmen with us. They ran out in the field and they put some panels out with us. C-47s went over in the first drop. All of the equipment was in parachutes, and it went down to the German lines. So the signalmen, they rearranged the panels, and another second flight came over, and they dropped all their stuff right down on us. A lot of it was in parachutes, low altitude. A lot of the planes were getting shot. One plane got hit, came in smoking, hit the field in front of us, skittered across a couple of barbed wire fences, and went towards this little white house that we'd seen near the road. When it came to a stop, the crew of the plane jumped out, and they ran like the hell for the woods, and a bunch of the paratroopers ran to the plane, and they started unloading the plane. They put the fire out, unloaded the plane. They wanted those supplies, and the Air Corps men, all they wanted was away from there. So anyway, I've seen this photograph of this same plane many times after that, but it sits out in the field all by itself. And anyway, this is where we were at when they were dropping the supplies. And one of the men, I got a fruitcake, and it was dropped in a tin. And it had Merry Christmas from Wing so-and-so of the Air Force, and I don't recall which one it was now, but they said Merry Christmas to the men in Bastogne. And this guy came through, and he had this large, round, colorful tin with a fruitcake in it, and he was passing out whoever wanted some of it, and I love fruitcake, so I got some of it. I said, well, I want to get some fruitcake too, if that's what they're dropping. And so anyway, someone dropped a toothbrush in a little package, and some toothpaste. So about 12 of the troopers got it, and they went down to this little creek, and they managed to chop a hole through the ice, and one man would brush his teeth, and then they were lined up, and he would hand the toothbrush and the toothpaste to the guy behind him, and he would brush his teeth and hand it to the man behind him, and so about 12 would brush their teeth with that toothbrush. And most of us, we did clean our teeth. I'd take a piece of pine bough and chew it, get it, and use it for a toothbrush. But anyway, I wanted this fruitcake, and I was on the lookout for it, and I was trying to get something for her, that was nice, like a cake or something. And I saw this big round object coming out of a plane, and I thought, well, that's a fruitcake. It was round. And I said, mine. I saw it first. And went underneath holding my arms up, and all of a sudden it got bigger and bigger. I thought, geez, look at, it was bigger than I figured. So I started running the other way and hit the ground. There was a big spool of communication wire about 5 feet in diameter. And it hit the ground and rolled and went down through the woods, and that's where the pilot retrieved it. But anyway, all the stuff that we pulled in from the DZ there, when they dropped everything, we had to turn it in. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. They sent trucks around and jeeps, and they picked everything up, took it back to a central place, and that way they could dispense it more equally and evenly throughout the division. In other words, it became part of the supply depot. And McAuliffe, he was also in charge. He was our commanding general at the time we were in Bastogne, and he was also in charge of the Army and everything there. And so I think at one time there wasn't too many tanks at that time, or TDs, and I think they had a total of about 500 gallons of fuel. So what they would do is leave just the tanks that were on guard with fuel in them. They would siphon the fuel out of the rest of them and hide it in cellars so it wouldn't get bombed and they'd lose it. And then when they got ready to go out with the tanks or half tracks or whatever, they would take the fuel they needed out of the cellars and fuel up the tanks and go out with it. But after they dropped the supplies, then later it was Colonel Abrams of the 4th Armored broke through to us. And there was a running battle back and forth in that particular thing. But anyway, they finally established a corridor through to us in there, and we got more supplies. And eventually we did get replacements and men. And one of the replacements came in with us was Carl Angley, who became a good friend of mine. And he survived the war, and I'm godfather to his oldest daughter now. But Carl died some years ago of a heart attack. But anyway, we did receive supplies. We received men replacements, and then there's a lot of attacks and things that went on in between this that I'm not covering here in detail, but we thought that we would be relieved, and we weren't. I know I saw a couple of movies about Bastogne where the armored broke through to us, we were relieved, but that wasn't the case. Actually, once we received replacements and men and ammunition and weapons, we went in the attack for 22 days, nights straight. And near the end of this, we returned back through Noville, where we had to pull out, and going to the north of Noville and around it. Captain Kessler, who took over command of A Company at that time, was hit by a small shell fragment in the right temple. It went underneath the rim of his helmet, hit him in the head, and killed him instantly. And Brennan Stool had just walked past him, and I was just behind Brennan Stool, and I heard Captain grunt, and he fell over and saw that he was hit in the head and was killed. And we made the attack back into Noville, and one of the funny things that happened there was a shell hit, we were coming down the hill on the north side into Noville, where the Germans was coming down on us before. An artillery shell from a long range came in and hit right in front of Dobrich. It actually bounced. It didn't go off. It bounced, and rotating end for end, it actually rolled over his shoulder. Went up to the hill way behind us, and Dobrich turned around and said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "Yeah, I went right up on the hill there." And we looked back up the hill, and this darn thing come tobogganing back down the hill, this artillery shell, and it was so hot, it was steaming. Came down like a toboggan, and we all started running to either side because you don't know when it's going to go off. But it went down all the way into Noville and went in between two buildings. As far as I know, it never did go off. But anyway, we recovered a Sherman tank the Germans were using. It was a brand new one. It was mounted with a 76 and a muzzle brake. I think it had 11 miles on the odometer. So we got an airborne tank, and we took it with us. Day was his name, Gerald Day. He operated the tank. But anyway, when we finally went back north and east of Noville, in our final attack, and this is, like I said, days later after we first went on December 19th, and I'm talking about even 22 days. We'd been there a week, so we was going to January beyond 45. And I finally came to a stop, and we made one attack, and the Germans threw artillery on us, and one shell hit. We set up a machine gun on one on either side. The shell hit, a lot of shells hit, but one of them hit right in front of I think his name was Grissom. And when it hit on such an angle that the fragments took his left arm off and took his left leg below the knee and his right leg above the knee, right there in the spot. And he was still conscious, and he asked us to look in the snow. The snow was up to our shirt pockets. He asked us to look in the snow and find his arm and get his watch because his mother and dad had given it to him for graduation. And we hunted, and we couldn't find his arm. And they took him out by jeep. And then our medic, Dave, from Maine, treating another man, stepped on something that rolled under his foot, and he pulled it up, and it was his arm. So he retrieved the watch and gave it, sent it to Grissom after the war was over. But we made the final attack. The same attack we went on. We bedded down for the night, dug in, and Lieutenant Dunham called me to him and asked me to take a patrol and make contact with B Company, supposed to be to our left flank. We were set up along a road. And I picked Liddell and Carl Angeli, our new replacement. We went out, and we went through B Company's lines, and as I learned later, they saw us coming. We never did find them, but they saw us coming, and they let us pass through the line knowing we were paratroopers. And of course, later when I reported, they all got their butts chewed because they say you challenge everybody. And this was a big mistake on a couple of guys' parts by not challenging everybody that came through their lines. But anyway, I went on through their lines with my patrol of two men and crossed the river, and I looked down between the ice where there's openings in the ice. I could see fast running water, and I got up into a high ground with some pines. And I thought we'd found what we were looking for, and I saw these trucks and tanks and things up in the woods there, and walked boldly right in the middle of it, and there's men sleeping on the ground. And Liddell, again, he looked, he said, "Hey, Don," he says, "look at those tanks." And I looked at them, and everything was German. We were right in the middle of a German bivouac of armored tanks, Tigers, Panthers, everything else. So anyway, I looked at Don Liddell, and he's got like 3 yards of white teeth. When he grins, he says, "What are you going to do now, Donnie boy?" I said, "We're going to tiptoe out of here." So we did. We cut back towards the little river, and we went on an angle, picked up our tracks, and went out of there. Later, after I got back to the where our command post was, our company CP, I asked for artillery on that wooded area where the encampment was, and they never did throw artillery on it. I don't know why, but they didn't. And at that time, we had plenty of artillery, or somebody did. But as we got to our foxholes, I seen 3 men walking toward us, and one of them looked just like Jack Bram. He had a white jacket, built like him and everything, and the 3 of them walked right past Brennistool. I don't want to put any bad reflection on Brennistool because he didn't challenge him either. And he told me, even to this day, he tells me, he says, I thought it was Jack Bram. Looked like him, walked like him, dressed like him. And he walked within about 50 feet of Don Brennistool's machine gun. And anyway, when I seen him, I yelled at him. They didn't answer. They just kept walking. I yelled at him again. I squatted down. I could see the Longville forage caps against the skyline. And I had my rifle to sling arm and threw it down. I said, or on him. And I said, hands up, they're crossed. I yelled real loud. And Brennistool realized it then, and he grabbed up the machine gun and swung it right around on the tripod and pointed towards him. And the Germans, they surrendered. They started yelling, "Comrade." And each one had a knapsack full of magazines for Schmeissers. Each one had a Schmeisser, and each one had a pistol. One had a Beretta, one had a B-38, and one had a Luger. But I gave the pistols away. And anyway, they were taken. Lieutenant Dunham called for a jeep that took them back to for interrogation. Yeah, and we were relieved by the 17th Airborne the next morning. So I believed now that I captured the last 3 Germans taken by the 506 in the Battle of the Bulge.
Now, who was it that had the 20 millimeter or whatever explode next to his helmet?
That would be Benson.
Benson, would you tell that story on him?
Yeah, that was
before this last thing.
Oh yeah, that was during the middle of the fighting. As I said, we had a lot of little battles that I didn't describe. I mean, a lot of that. You bring them to mind from time to time. This one battle, we were ordered to clear a patch of woods, and we had to go down a long road through the cedar, and it was almost like a tunnel. And when we got to the end of this road, there was a big square field with waist deep with snow right up to our waist deep, up to our shirt pockets. And in the wooded area beyond that is where the Germans were. And as we got right to the edge of this field, or this open field, we found a half-track that was mounted with quad 50s, evidently left there by when the Germans first attacked. These guys left the half-track with the quad 50s. Everything was operational. The guns were fully loaded and everything. So I believe it was Thomas. He got in and fired it up, and he backed that half-track up to the edge of the field. And when we got the order to go ahead and attack, he yelled, "Let's go." He got up there, and he opened up with the quad 50s, and he raked that field, the woods opposite us with the 50s. And so we made the attack, and he ran all the ammo out of him. He didn't just quit firing, but he fired every last round. We entered the woods, and by this time the Germans had taken refuge in their holes. Some of them did come out and was firing. We was throwing grenades in all their bunkers, and mostly grenade fights in that one. But Benson, all of a sudden, I don't know what it was, a rifle grenade or whatever it was, a tree mine, what we called a tree mine, or booby trap. But something went off on a tree. We seen the tree splinter and the bark come off, and something impacted Benson right on the right side of the helmet. He crushed his helmet flat on his head. And he went out of his mind. He dropped his carbine. He was running around in small circles, and white foam started coming out of his mouth. And then he fell on the ground. He started flopping around like a fish. And so we tackled him, and we tied him. We tied his hands and feet, and we finally pried his helmet off. His helmet was on his head so tight we had to pry it off. And anyway, we left him there for the medics. We went on with the attack, and the medics did get him, and they did take him away. And about 2 or 3 days later, Benson came walking into our outfit. No helmet, no weapon, no nothing. And he didn't want to stay in the hospital. He snuck away and came, found out where we were at and rejoined us. And we outfitted him with a helmet and a carbine and everything. And I talked to Benson some years later, and I asked him how he was doing. This is by phone. He lived in Nashville, Tennessee. And he said that he had become paralyzed on the left side of his body, and he had a job working in a lumberyard as a counterman. And I told him that he was hit. He said, no, I wasn't. I said, yeah, you was hit in the head. He said, well, that's what the doctor told him. He went to the VA hospital. The doctor told him that he had a terrible, crushed his head in and had a terrible damage up there. And he said, no, I was never hit. He couldn't remember it. But there again, that's not his fault. You know, his brain was damaged, but damaged to the point where he became, a few years after the war, or a couple of years after the war, he became paralyzed completely on the left side. And a few years later, he died as a result of those injuries. And he never received compensation from the government. And when I found out that he was paralyzed, I began writing letters trying to get him compensation, but he died before anything can be done.
Did you say he contacted you when your book first came out?
Yeah.
So that would make it in the late 60s, and it was a couple of years after that.
My book came out in 67, and he contacted me almost every year.
But when he died, it would have been 2 years.
About 2 years after that, about 69, he died.
Okay. And the damage to his helmet was on the right side of the helmet, and that caused paralysis on the left side.
Yeah, smashed in the whole right side of his helmet and his head.
You said it took 3 troopers to pry the helmet open.
Yeah, Liddell and myself and Phillips, we had to hold him down and pry the helmet off of him. And it was white foam kept coming out of his mouth. Why that, I don't know, but he was strictly out of it. He was flopping around like a fish. He didn't know anything. We had to tie him. We actually had to tie his hands behind him and tie his feet together.
Do you recall what you used to tie him with?
Just cord. We usually carried little pieces of rope like we had for our seaborne rolls and everything like that. We always carried something like that for tying. Carried, like pieces of suspension line from your parachutes. It's kind of like paratroopers become pack rats, and you carry a little cord for this and whatever else you can get into your jump pants pockets, because you never know when you're going to need it.
Yeah, but can we jump ahead to one story that's way up after the war, and that you're talking about? I think it was John B. Woods having Colonel Sink's Jeep. Why did he have the Jeep in the first place again, or how did that all come about? You were near Brook, Austria when it.
We were in Brook, Austria. Yeah, we were in Taxenbach. We moved from Taxenbach to Brook, and that's where we set up his army of occupation. We even had the German prisoners build us a day room. We paid them 2 cigarettes a day for carpentry work. And even if they didn't smoke, they could trade the cigarettes off for something. But that was the general wages, was 2 cigarettes for 8 hours work. And anyway, we were pretty well stationed in Brook at this time, and we'd ride horses down to Zelmsee and had a pretty good time after the war was over. But we took over these German houses, and in the particular house we was in, we allowed the German family to live there, the Austrian family. They lived in the back part, and they had a teenage daughter, and of course the woman, the old man. And we were drinking one night, and we ran out of cognac. So he said, well, I know where there's a bunch, and we allowed these people to drink with us, and we got friendly with them. So he said, yeah, there's lots, gross, lots of cognac. So anyway, he said he could show us where it was at. So we put a raincoat on him and a helmet liner. And his wife said, no, if he got caught like that, he'd be a spy and he's going to shoot him. But anyhow, we went down there, and I think it was it wasn't John B. Woods, it was Borchers. Borchers was the one when we broke into this house. German showed us, or this Austrian showed us where the house was, and it happened to be Colonel Sink's headquarters. We didn't know this. We broke through the window, we got in the basement, and he showed us where the liquor was kept, and the whiskey and everything, the cognac. So anyway, it was in a big cellar which had a padlock on. So Borchers, we were all about 3 sheets in the wind. Borchers says, I know how to get it open. I thought, well, he's from Chicago. I said, these are those few tricks that I don't know. Pulled out a .45 out of a shoulder holster and shot the lock off. Well, 45 going off inside the house. So anyway, we could hear Colonel Sink's feet hit the deck upstairs, and a bunch of other people, they come running down the stairs, and we went out the side window, the basement window. But it had this old guy with us too. We had to drag him out the window. And Colonel Sink's Jeep was there. Well, that's when Borchers fired it up. We got it started, and we took off from there with Colonel Sink's Jeep. Well, Borchers hid it out for a while. In fact, we took it to LMZ one time. Borchers and I came back, and so he hid it again. And John B. Woods, he was from Far Rockaway, New York, and he had never had the opportunity to drive a car and didn't know how. So when we weren't looking one day, he got hold of that Jeep and he started it up and he drove it off the cliff. And we have a picture of him standing there on guard duty. He's got a head all wrapped up with a great big bandage, looked like a turban. And I said, "Hey, John B., I didn't know when he drove it off. I said, how'd you do that?" He said, "I drove a car off a cliff, or off a mountain." He said, "I drove the car off the mountain." Come to find out, he was the one that wrecked Colonel Sink's Jeep. But we were the ones that stole it. We didn't get any cognac that night either.
So, how many days did you have Sink's Jeep before it was wrecked there, you know?
About 3 days.
About 3 days. He never found out who took it? Or
No, we had it hid. We just didn't happen to run into it. We drove it clear to Zelmsee, and back again. Well, what was funny, when we was driving the Jeep, I was driving, and there was two girls walking up ahead, and of course they heard us coming. They turned around, looked, of course they wiggled a little bit more when he was walking. The Borcher says, "Pull over, I want to pat that one on the butt." Well, I don't know, I must have been doing what I thought was slow, probably about 20 miles an hour, and he reached out and he hit that girl in the butt. Man, he turned her around. She went about 4 feet in the air, came out, and I looked over to him, he was shaking his head, and she said, "God, that hurt." And I said, "What's the thing about her?" It smacked her in the butt when it went by, But we hid the Jeep out, and then John B. Woods got a hold of it and wrecked it. Don't tell Colonel Sink.